Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pink Flame of Liberty radio show. I am Karen Ann Harlos, first of her name of the House Anarchy, mother of parrots, purveyor of liberty, and herder of butts. You can always watch this at least closely in real time on my YouTube channel of youtube.com/Pink Flame of Liberty. And you can always write me at pinkflameofliberty@gmail.com with any comments or about any advertising opportunities on this program. I would love to hear from you, and the rates are excellent, and the host is just phenomenal, if I don't say so myself. Unlike prior weeks, I will not be available to interact with you in live time at the time this is broadcast because I will be assisting with canvassing with RCV Colorado in Broomfield. So what is RCV? It is ranked choice voting. And as you know, one of the sponsors of this show is the Approval Voting Party in Colorado. And I'll tell you more about them hopefully in the second segment of this show. But ranked choice voting is another alternate voting system. And either system, approval voting or ranked choice voting, would be vastly better than the broken first past the post system we have now, which is just plain old plurality voting. The one person who gets the most votes wins, whether or not they've even gotten a majority, or whether or not the majority of people actually voted combined for somebody else and that they were, in actuality, disapproved. Now, both of these two alternative systems, ranked choice, approval voting, they both have their strengths in different kinds of elections. Approval voting, in my opinion, is superior in multi-winner races and ranked choice voting in single-winner races. But again, both are better than what we have now, no matter what type of race you are talking about. So today in Broomfield, I will be canvassing for their ballot measure 2A. And if 2A wins, that would make Broomfield the first city and county to use ranked choice voting for all of its municipal elections. Boulder had just opted to use ranked choice voting for its mayor election, and I hope to be petitioning to get a similar measure to Broomfield in place for Castle Rock, and will probably be petitioning next year. So a victory in Broomfield would be pretty significant to an effort in Castle Rock. So in short, ranked choice voting is very similar to what you and I are already used to, ranking choices like we do when we're buying products. I have some demonstrations of using RCV in internal Libertarian Party elections, such as our last, we had to replace our chair because of me. I whistle blew, and our last chair turned out to be corrupt, and he got removed, and then I got retaliated against as a whistleblower, as you do. But I do have a demonstration of using RCV in selecting our replacement chair, and it's a really good demonstration on how to arrive at a consensus candidate. I'm also involved in volunteering with the group called RCV Colorado, and I want to play for you an educational video, but the audio is also very good, so you guys on the radio will not miss out, that explains basically what RC voting does and its advantages. You can watch the video itself either in the reproduction of this show on my YouTube channel or under educational resources at rcvforcolorado.org. And there's other great resources there as well. So let's take a watch or listen.
Ranked choice voting frees the voter to have more voice. But how does it find the consensus? Let's see an example in an election for coolest Colorado animal. Our candidates are bear, bighorn sheep, and mountain lion. Ranked choice gives every candidate an equal opportunity to win and lets voters freely express their preferences. On your ballot, you can mark as many or as few candidates as you like. Let's say I love mountain lion because cats are cool, so I'll mark them in the first choice column. I like bighorn sheep because they're light on their feet too. I'll mark them in the second choice column. I'm okay with bear, so I mark them number 3. If I really didn't like bear, I don't have to rank them at all. That's it. I've ranked my choices. Let's see how it plays out in the results. There are 100 votes cast. Bear has 40 of the first choice votes, Bighorn sheep has 45, and mountain lion has 15. Since no candidate received over 50% of the votes, an automatic runoff is triggered. In round 2, mountain lion is eliminated. Sorry, mountain lion, but we still include mountain lion supporters. 5 of the mountain lion voters picked bear as their second choice. We add those votes to bear's first round choices for a total of 45 votes. 10 of the mountain lion voters picked bighorn sheep as their second choice. We add those votes to bighorn sheep's first round choices for a total of 55 votes. With the consensus of the majority, the winner is bighorn sheep. Congratulations, bighorn sheep, the coolest Colorado animal. Ranked choice is being used in more and more elections around the country, including local races in Colorado. Why are more places using ranked choice? Ranked choice is more fair. It protects the integrity of elections by requiring a majority of support to win. It has built-in safety. If a candidate drops out, the voters are protected from being left out. Ranked choice frees voters to rank the candidates secure from worries of wasting their vote. Ranked choice has proven results. Candidates have to focus on ideas and issues to win the consensus. RCV means equity. All candidates have equal opportunity. We see more people of color and women run in RCV. Ranked choice means inclusion. More people of color and women win and take a seat at the table. Ranked choice is a proven system, used in the U.S. for over 100 years. Want more voice on Election Day? Visit rcvforcolorado.org to find out how.
Now, this brings us to this episode's topic of the Colorado statewide ballot initiatives. But to talk properly about them, in my ever so humble opinion, I think we need to talk a little bit about TABOR, which is the Colorado Taxpayer Bill of Rights, as it will inevitably come up, and a TABOR issue which has been annoying me, and that is the way that the court has gutted the 4-year time limit on TABOR timeouts. Now, before we get to that, there's actually a little background on me that I would like to tell you, since some of you do not know. Back in 2016, there was a Colorado law, as there was in a lot of states, that made it illegal for you to take what's called a ballot selfie, posting on social media showing how you voted. And the Denver district attorney actually posted a threat on Facebook saying, remember, it's illegal. And that was, I took it definitely as a threat. You have the DA reminding everyone not to do this. And that put a burr under my saddle, as state threats do when our liberties are infringed upon. And I had decided at that point, all of a sudden, I had a hankering as the communications director at that time for the Libertarian Party of Colorado to post a picture of my ballot selfie marked with Gary Johnson in order to promote my candidate, because I was, in fact, the communications director for the third largest political party in the country. But I could be prosecuted. There was a credible fear of prosecution, and at the time I worked as a paralegal. That is definitely not something that would look good on my paralegal certification and could in fact be disqualifying, so I was not particularly interested in potentially spending jail time or paying a fine. I believe it was a third-degree misdemeanor at the time. So myself and multiple others from the entire political spectrum, including one Republican state senator, sued the state of Colorado for the right to take our ballot selfies. And then the legislature, the next session, overturned that law. We did win the lawsuit. So from that point on, anyone could have taken their ballot selfie, but then the legislature overturned this law. And one of the arguments that was made was that this law hadn't been prosecuted in over 100 years or something to that effect. then why is it on the books? And the court agreed. The court agreed and said the fact that you haven't prosecuted it is not an argument, because you might have something else against somebody doing that. And while you might not be inclined to prosecute them for taking their ballot selfie, perhaps you can't snag them on the thing you would like to, or perhaps you do not like political dissidents, such as yours truly. And the court ruled that even the existence of the law, along with the credible threat that was made, was a sword of Damocles over the heads of Colorado voters in expressing their right to political free speech. And an argument that the state of Colorado actually made was, we're not restricting your political free speech. You could always just talk a different way. You can express yourself a different way. And the fact that that argument was even made allegedly in the land of the free just burns my biscuits. And it reminds me of something that was said. And there's a book I'm reading right now called Radicals for Capitalism. And I believe it was Murray Rothbard who said, "You think you're free? You think you're free?" It might not have been him, but it was someone in that book. I'm pretty sure it was Rothbard. Just try testing it. Try operating a business without a license. Try driving without a license. Try just marrying whomever, whenever you want. Try doing a host of things. Try putting anything in your body that you'd like and see how free you really are. The way it was put, and this will be very close, if not an exact quote, is that we have this balloon of freedom that's floating around in a pin factory. I do think this is a great time to do the advertisement for approval voting. Approval voting, like ranked choice voting, moves us beyond two-party thinking and will be good for the voters of Colorado. It will cause fewer spoilers. Voters can vote for both a candidate that they really like that has no chance of winning, and also a more popular candidate who has a chance of winning. There will be more civility. When a group of friends want to stay friends and they're trying to decide on something like what restaurant are we going to go eat at or what movie do we want to see, they use a show of hands, and the option that gets the highest number of hands is the one that wins, and that's just approval voting. There will be less polarization. The voter is not forced to focus on only one or two candidates. Again, approval voting will move us beyond two-party thinking, which we desperately need. If you'd like more information, please contact Colorado's approval voting effort by phone or text at 720-439-6000 or search for the Approval Voting Party. Again, that number is 720-439-6000, and I thank you so much for being a sponsor of this show. Okay, so what in fact is TABOR? I think Wikipedia had actually a good summary of it that I'd like to read to you. It says, in 1992, the voters of the state approved a measure which amended Article 10 of the Colorado Constitution that restricts revenues for all levels of government, state, local, and schools. Funny. Schools as part of government. That just makes me want to vomit in my mouth. Under TABOR, state and local governments cannot raise tax rates without voter approval and cannot spend revenues collected under existing tax rates without voter approval if revenues grow faster than the rate of inflation and population growth. And to me, that seems to make sense. But making sense isn't government's forte. Revenues in excess of the TABOR limit, commonly referred to as the TABOR surplus, must be refunded to taxpayers unless voters approve a revenue change as an offset in a referendum. Under TABOR, the state has returned more than $2 billion to taxpayers. I'm not sure when this Wikipedia article was written. I'm sure that's more by now. Well, maybe it's not, going by what we're going to talk about next. This allowance for spending to grow at the rate of inflation plus population growth means that inflation-adjusted per capita spending generally did not decrease. However, spending growth could be interrupted due to an economic recession, in which case inflation-adjusted per capita spending to return to its pre-recession level. This was known as the ratchet down effect, and it occurred in fiscal year 2001 through 2002 and 2002 through 2003. The ratchet down effect was desirable to those who believed government was consuming too large a fraction of Colorado's gross state product, such as myself, and undesirable to those who believed government was consuming too small a fraction of Colorado's GSP, like the Democrats and Republicans. In November 2005, Coloradans approved Referendum C, a ballot measure that loosened many of TABOR's restrictions. This measure allows the state to retain and spend money from existing revenue sources above the TABOR limit each year, beginning in fiscal year 2005 through 2006. The state may spend all revenue subject to TABOR for 5 years through fiscal year ending 2010. Then the state may spend revenue above the TABOR limit up to a capped amount known as the Referendum C cap. The Referendum C cap grows from the prior year's cap instead of the prior year's spending by inflation plus population growth. In effect, Referendum C eliminated the ratchet down effect. Now, I went and actually, go figured, took a look at the actual text of TABOR because I really wanted to see the way the state, meaning any level of government, was getting around the 4-year limit that was intended to be in TABOR. And what this 4-year limit was supposed to be, that a level of government could take what is called a TABOR timeout for a period of 4 years, where they could, by vote of the voters, keep the excess revenue that normally would be refunded for a maximum of 4 years. That was the intent. I know that from talking to the wonderful and irascible Doug Bruce, who was the architect of TABOR. It was, his life's work up to that point. So that is also, as I said, known as a TABOR timeout, and more insultingly referred to as de-Brucing because of Doug Bruce. And he doesn't particularly care for that term, just so you know. So in taking a look at the text of TABOR, and those watching a video can see, I did do some handy-dandy highlighting. I wanted to see where this 4-year limit was put into place. And I'm going to criticize some of the language of TABOR with all due respect to Doug Bruce. Sometimes you never know how wily the state is going to be and its courts, which, they're paid by the state. How we expect them to really represent the citizens is beyond me. Sometimes our court system can be decent, but most cases it's the fox guarding the hen house because they know where their bread is buttered. They're paid by the state through stolen money. So it seemed to me that the things that were really important for this, first of all, there is a key to interpretation of TABOR in the very beginning. It says that TABOR's preferred interpretation shall reasonably restrain most the growth of government. So if you have multiple interpretations, it's telling you right in the beginning the one that is correct is the one that restrains government the most. I thought that was very clever to put in the beginning. Okay, so there's some term definitions in TABOR. For instance, quote unquote, ballot issue means a non-recall petition or referred measure in an election. It's basically most of the time the way that, overruling TABOR or taking a TABOR timeout would occur. And those can only happen in odd year elections, which is why we have a bunch of these coming up in November in local municipalities and at the statewide level. It also says under election provisions, ballot issues shall be decided in a state general election, biennial local district election, or on the first Tuesday in November of odd numbered years, like I said, except for petitions, bonded debt, or charter or constitutional provisions. Districts may consolidate ballot issues, and voters may approve a delay of up to 4 years in voting on ballot issues. District actions taking during such a delay shall not extend beyond that period. Now, that is the language that turns out to be in question. Voters may approve a delay of up to 4 years in voting on ballot issues, and district actions taken during such a delay shall not extend beyond that period. That was intended to allow TABOR pauses only for 4 years. When Castle Rock tried to do one for 10 years, I challenged them, and they pointed me to 2 court cases which overruled this provision, or actually interpreted it in a completely nonsensical way. And as a paralegal myself, not an attorney, don't come at me, state. I'm not doing the unauthorized practice of law. I'm just stating my opinion. Seriously offended my intelligence. So there were 2 cases, both in the Colorado Supreme Court. One is the City of Aurora versus Acosta, which isn't the one that's directly on point. The one that's directly on point is Havens versus Board of County Commissioners of the County of Archuleta. One was decided in 95, one was decided in 96. And it basically said voters can allow their local governments to keep revenues in excess of TABOR limits using parameters as broad or as narrow as they may choose, including in perpetuity. So they basically, in 1 year, can override a part of the Colorado Constitution. So I pulled those cases. Of course I did. And I took a look at how they possibly got to this ridiculous interpretation. So in the court case that is relevant, it says that the trial court either dismissed or entered judgment on the pleadings in favor of the county on all of plaintiffs' claims. Now remember, the plaintiffs were protesting because the TABOR quote-unquote timeout was in perpetuity. It wasn't a timeout. It was a complete overturning of that provision of the Colorado Constitution. The trial court interpreted that section I read that I said would be the issue, that providing that voters can delay ballot issues for up to 4 years and decline to read it as a 4-year restriction for waiver of revenue and spending limits. What they actually read it to mean is, well, we want to vote on waiving TABOR, but voters can vote to delay the vote on the vote for 4 years. Does that make any lick of sense to you? Of course, they didn't word it as bluntly as I did, because then it would be quite obvious how utterly stupid that is. The court went on to say, we agree with the trial court that it does not make sense for the TABOR drafters to use the word delay if they were referring to a time limitation on waiver of revenue and spending limits. Though speaking of the creators of TABOR, that's exactly what they meant. Thus, we reject plaintiff's assertion that delay here means voters may approve the ballot issue for up to 4 years. So, it says we are not persuaded by the argument that this construction is inconsistent with the last sentence, which says district actions taken during such a delay shall not extend beyond that time period. But the interpretation that it's a limitation on the revenues is the only one that makes sense with that sentence. What does it mean if the voters just delayed voting on the vote for 4 years, that district actions couldn't be impacted during that 4-year period? And what the court basically held is that later on in TABOR, where it talks about certain revenue that can be restricted through TABOR, that it didn't repeat itself in talking about this 4-year time limitation. And this is how we get laws that are 1 million pages long that no one reads because of this kind of ridiculousness. Okay, welcome back. And before we get started, are you in the market to buy or sell your home? I would hope that you would consider engaging a liberty-loving realtor that I can vouch for on the highest possible terms. And that is my husband, Wayne Harlos of the Harlos Real Estate Team. And not just because he's my husband and obviously has very excellent taste in women. We have shared a home office for years, and in that time, I've seen how much time and care he takes with each and every client. In the past, I have bought and sold several homes, and never did my realtor take this amount of time and care, no matter what the dollar value of the sale is. In fact, my experience has been that particularly if you're a first-time home buyer or seller, and even more so if you're in the lower value of the market, the starter home market, that realtors have bigger fish to fry bigger commissions to make, and they spend the least amount of time with you and rush you along. And that is not the way Wayne operates. In fact, he takes so much time and care that when job duties call, I'm sometimes kept waiting, and I am not always the most patient of women. Getting a good and caring realtor is one of the most important decisions that you can make. So please do consider giving Wayne a call at 303-229-3435 or emailing him at wayne@harlosrealestateteam.com. If he doesn't service your area, he will help you find a good agent. And even if you are not quite yet ready to buy or sell, he is still glad to offer service. Okay, let's continue. And we are going to be getting to Amendment 78, which I'm just going to give you the spoiler. The spoiler is, unlike most conservatives or Republicans and most libertarians, I am not recommending a yes vote on it. I am recommending a no. And I do intend upon defending that particular recommendation. So what does Amendment 78 do? It amends the state constitution to require that custodial monies that get awarded to the state government, things such as from the CARES Act, transportation funding, grants, gifts, rewards from state government lawsuits, etc., are subject to the same appropriations legislation as all other state revenues. It creates a custodial fund parallel to the general fund to hold those funds, with earnings on those funds going into the general fund. It exempts the custodial funds from TABOR limits. There's a question as to whether they've always been exempt or not. So basically, these funds right now are in the sole control of the governor. This would put it subject to control of the legislature. Now, I am indebted to a Libertarian Party member of Colorado here named Mike Seebeck, and he had come to the recommendation of no on this. And I have come to agree, but for additional reasons than he stated. But I'd like to go over his reasons first. Okay, his reasoning was that these custodial funds are currently outside the legislative process, and therefore they are available at the discretion of the executive branch to be spent how they see fit without oversight. I would disagree on that slightly. There is some oversight, and there is always ultimately the oversight of the voters. That is the oversight of last resort. And that's a recipe, obviously, for corruption and patronage, but so would it be at the legislative level. So is all money that is obtained through theft, as is this government largesse, except possibly for certain government lawsuits that are won. But in general, this is just passing stolen money around. Now, since these parallel custodial funds would be exempt from TABOR, again, we're going to get into whether they were even under the custodianship of the government. It opens a different, I said government, of the governor, which opens a different door for possible corruption. So what this is the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. What kind of corruption would you rather have? Which is almost always the case when you're dealing with the government. But the possible corruption in this case is by laundering general funds into a custodial fund to get around the TABOR requirements for the general fund. Currently, custodial funds are, in fact, I believe, exempt from TABOR restrictions, no matter whose control they're under. And they aren't subject to legislative oversight, which seems like a bad idea, but in some ways it's actually a good idea. Because by saying, oh, we are going to make it more transparent by putting it under the legislature, this is a potential bait and switch. The bait is this alleged transparency for custodial funds, but the switch is the opening of a major TABOR loophole, not by making more funds exempt from TABOR, but because money is fungible. It allows things to be slipped around and to not spend the TABOR funds or the TABOR exempted funds, spend more in the general fund, and then you have the TABOR fund as a slush fund. This is a loophole that is a cure worse than the disease it is trying to, take care of. At least with the current system, the corruption is limited, and it is somewhat more easy to see it. Obviously, it's in the hands of one person. It's easier to get rid of one person than an entire legislature. So let's get into the weeds a little bit. Section 1 of this proposal amends Colorado Constitution Article 5, Section 33. So currently, custodial funds could be dispersed at the discretion of the governor, attorney general, treasurer, and so on, depending on who had the custody of the funds, and they are authorized by law to do that. The amendment would require all custodial monies to be dispersed by the treasurer only when appropriated by the legislature. It also changes the section to put all disbursements subject to appropriation by the legislature by removing a clause that covered all the other authorizations. Section 2 amends Colorado Revised Statute 24-31-108, subsection 5, which deals with custodial funds for the Attorney General's office. So currently, if the AG receives funds for the state, they must be paid to the Treasury as soon as practicable and can be appropriated by the legislature. Gifts, grants, and donations to the AG earmarked for specific things also go to the Treasury, but the Treasurer puts those in appropriate funds as determined by the AG and are considered already appropriated by the legislature. So this is all the current setup. So in other words, if it's not earmarked for a fund, it goes into the general fund for appropriation by the legislature. But if it's earmarked for a fund, it simply goes to that earmarked fund. Attorney fees received by the AG are placed in a separate fund and are subject to appropriation for that department. The Treasury has a legal services cash fund. The fund gets its money through the treasurer from the AG, but the legislature can appropriate it to the department, and leftovers there stay there from year to year. If any of the money received by the AG is custodial money, the AG tells the treasurer to put it in a separate account, which is then exempt from appropriation. The Legislative Joint Budget Committee and treasurer are notified of the amount, indicating the amount and why it is custodial and how it will be spent, and they can only be spent that way, and are listed in the General Appropriation Act for reference. Now, custodial money is defined as money from outside the state, awarded for a specific purpose, or that the state government is a custodian or trustee to use the money for its intended purpose. Now, the amendment for Section 5 would remove that exemption from appropriation, the reporting requirement to the Joint Budget Committee and the Treasurer, the restriction on how the custodial funds are spent, and the listing of the funds in the General Appropriation Act. The net result is that custodial funds will still wind up in a separate account as before, but they can be appropriated by the legislature. Section 3 amends certain sections of the Colorado Revised Statutes. I'm not going to bore you with the numbers, and deals with, again, custodial funds and surplus funds in the general fund. Currently, these sections address how the general fund is created and what goes into it. Section 3 states that custodial funds do not include federal grants for the general government services, but that such funds go into the general fund to be appropriated. God, I know this is boring as heck. The amendment would mimic this language with the exception that it would apply to all money received by the state and not just the AG's office. It would create a custodial funds transparency fund, which would receive all custodial monies received by the state government and not just the AG as before. Earnings and revenue from this fund go into the general fund. Base monies received, not earnings or revenue, stay in the fund from year to year. And starting in 2022, the legislature can appropriate money from the fund, and it would require public hearings and comment for such appropriations. Now, here's where things get a bit controversial, is that some are saying that the net effect is that some of the previous custodial funds were exempt from TABOR under the law, but now with them all going into the one custodial fund, into that one fund, that entire fund would be exempt from TABOR. The TABOR Foundation, which exists to advocate for TABOR, says they haven't found this. I think this is somewhat in controversy at this time. But the question is, why was this language needed at all? The general fund was and is subject to TABOR, But the current wording of the statutes two amended do not contain the TABOR exemption clause because they were already exempt by themselves. But there's more than those funds that go into this new fund. And that is why it said that new language is added to say it removes everything from TABOR. Okay, after the break, I will try to put this in plainer, conclusory words to let you know why I am recommending a no. All right, hopefully now to put this all together. What this means is that the Custodial Funds Transparency Fund would be exempt from TABOR and create a common pool of custodial funds from which certain earmarked spending can be made outside of the general fund and its TABOR limits. It can earn interest and revenue as if it were an investment fund, and that also goes into the general fund, so it can act like a trust. So what goes into the fund are certain revenue streams, including the CARES Act, federal welfare, education, and transportation grants, all state transportation funding, and this is where state, federal gas taxes, car registration fees go, okay, gifts and donations from people, and legal settlements. And there is the huge loophole and the problem. The legislature can appropriate those funds differently in spite of the earmark purposes, and that creates both a political fight for these monies, and since the monies in the fund are exempt from TABOR, so are the appropriations. There is nothing to prevent the legislature from routing revenue away from the general fund and into the custodial fund directly from collections at their whim and then reappropriating it out of the fund to whatever they want. Or at least this is the possibility that looks like it is there, thus creating a laundering process to get around TABOR restrictions on the general fund. In other words, it's possible that your taxes could be rerouted from going into the general fund now into the custodial fund by legislative fiat, and then so much for TABOR. Myself and Mike Seebeck would love to see how this is impossible or in error. And as for the political fight over the money, 78 makes it possible to take earmarked transportation funds and put them elsewhere based upon political preferences like welfare, etc. Who gets what becomes based on who is in charge, not where the needs are. Denver and Boulder win while the rest of the state loses. And this is especially true with the transportation funds, which are already unbalanced in favor of Denver at the expense of the rest of the state falling apart. Plus, since these custodial funds include legal settlements, there's nothing to stop one part of the state government from suing another part over appropriations, then colluding together to settle the case and route the settlement into the fund, again putting it beyond TABOR. With as many shell games as we know government legislatures play to get around TABOR, here's another one, suing Peter to pay Paul, but Peter and Paul are in cahoots. So overall, with all of these potential pitfalls, this is a bad idea. All they had to do was eliminate the custodial funds in the first place and put it all into the general fund. Or even better, leaving it alone, except for making the custodial fund subject to TABOR by amending that part of the state constitution. If they'd done that, perhaps 78 would be more palatable. So 78 is a worse solution in search of a bad problem, but a bad problem that doesn't really yet exist. And there are simpler ways to solve it without screwing or potentially screwing with TABOR. The simplest way is to eliminate the custodial funds completely and put all of those funds into the general fund, with the requirement that their earmarks be honored when they aren't for patronage or other cronyism, which is what the proponents are complaining about in the first place. Now, note that this proposal is mainly endorsed by the right and not by the left. Right now, the Libertarian Party of Colorado has taken no position on it because of all of this potential confusion. Newspapers are split along partisan lines. The Denver Post, the Boulder Daily Camera, the Steamboat Springs Pilot, the Grand Junction Sentinel, the Durango Herald, and the Aurora Daily Sentinel have all opposed it, along with the Colorado DP. The Colorado Springs Gazette has endorsed it, as have the Colorado RP. So, split along party lines. The Pueblo chieftain has been silent. There was also a pending lawsuit to block this measure because of the claim that odd-year elections are only supposed to deal with TABOR-related issues. And interestingly, the suit was dismissed on October 22nd because the court said this does deal with TABOR. Now, I realize that the TABOR Foundation is recommending passage of this bill because of this reason. It says this constitutional amendment respects the separation of powers by putting the General Assembly into the process of appropriating revenues received by the state government. As the system works now, only the governor and his appointed agencies determine how federal grants like COVID relief funds or money from legal settlements are spent. The legislative process allows for public comment and input, which is absent under the current system. And they say passage of this measure would put that process in place, respecting an intent of TABOR. The TABOR committee is also alarmed that so much power is currently in the hands of one person, which violates one of the founding principles of American governance. Some concern exists that taxes currently counted towards TABOR annual limitation will be made exempt, but the committee was unable to identify any. Well, there was some potentially identified earlier, and the court certainly thought there was. That's why the lawsuit was dismissed. So they endorse the proposal on the grounds of proper separation of powers. Now, I don't often agree with Democrats. I don't often agree with Republicans either, though I would say on average I probably agree with them slightly more than Democrats. But I do think the Democrat talking points on this have merit. The fact is that a lot of these funds are for disaster relief or things in which decisions need to be made on a dime. We have a part-time legislature, and I like it that way. I do not want a full-time legislature where they have the whole year to screw with us and impinge upon our freedom. Do we really want special sessions to be called to deal with this? Do we really want to ask these rulers to find more ways, to have more time to meddle with us? The fact that this requires somebody or a body that is there all of the time that can move on a dime makes it ideally suited to the governor's office, in my particular opinion. I do not want to start laying the foundation for some future plea for a full-time legislature. And adding more tasks to the legislature will encourage just that. Also, you have then more political interests jockeying for these funds. With more people, you have more people than horse trading, and you start politicizing. Though I do realize it's still politicized when it's in the governor's hands, but it's politicized to a fewer amount of people. And having less oversight is bad, I know, on one hand, but it's better on another hand that you don't have so many competing political interests that are going to politicize things like research grants that go to Colorado universities. And when you start hyper-politicizing those things, then other states end up getting those grants. Now I am not in favor of the federal grants to begin with. Again, I don't think the federal government has any place doing that. I don't think that is a proper function of government. I believe in localization, but this is the system that we have now. And I do not want to see politicizing research grants. Everything else gets politicized, and who knows what it will be horse traded for. Again, there are so many potential unintended consequences here that whenever I fear that, I always vote no. This whole idea of transparency, oh, this is so good. The fact is that it sounds so good, it's too good to be true. Why was this not brought up before? It wasn't brought up when we had a Republican governor. Why are the Republicans so concerned about it now? The whole thing has a weird smell to it. I don't like it. I would recommend a no vote on it. The other ones I think are much simpler to freedom lovers. For instance, Proposition 119, which increases the marijuana sales tax even more. Do they want a bigger black market? Do you want a black market? Because this is how you get a black market. You just keep on doing what you're doing, and then you'll have a bigger black market, which, it defeats the whole purpose of legalizing recreational marijuana to begin with. And I don't know, I find something distasteful of the think of the children when you're dealing with an obvious adult activity, such as the consumption of intoxicants. Well, we're going to do this to have this tutoring program. Well, I wonder why we need a tutoring program to begin with. Is that because the public schools suck and that we probably shouldn't have this mandatory public education that's funded by theft from property taxes, even from people who don't have children, with this mandatory curriculum? Or do we need to go back to having parents responsible for the education of their children, including the content and including the funding? But you also will then have this unelected board, and it's appointed board, that will be in charge of all of these extra monies that, again, I'm sure there will be a hefty administrative slice taken off the top. This is just a terrible idea, no matter which way you slice it. And it's also unknown, how would this work if 78 passes regarding custodial funds? The TABOR exemption already exists on cannabis sales taxes. That's a different mistake, but it's there. This is a bad solution to a problem. Rather than increasing taxes on cannabis to fund a completely unrelated activity, why don't we figure out why the schools are not appropriately and effectively teaching the children, so that we need these tutoring and enrichment programs to begin with? I don't know. What a thought. And just quickly on 120, it lowers taxes. It might not have done what we originally wanted it to do, but it does lower property taxes both on residential properties and commercial properties. And even if it was just for one category, lowering taxes, yes, go for it. And that is my recommendation on that. Well, that went fast. Thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you next week, and you have yourself an awesome, awesome week of freedom as best you can.